Okay, moving along with René Girard. I see Satan fall like lightning. We are on Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is entitled The Founding Murder. And we'll just go ahead and get started here. Behind the Passion of Christ, behind a number of biblical dramas, behind many mythical dramas, and behind primitive rituals, we find the same process. The process of crisis and resolution founded on the same error, the same illusion. This illusion is the misunderstanding about the single victim who pays the price of the mimetic cycle. When we examine the great stories of origin and the founding myths, we notice that they themselves proclaim the fundamental and founding role of the single victim and his or her unanimous murder. The idea is present everywhere. In Sumerian mythology, cultural institutions emerge from a single victim, Ea, Tiamat, Kingu. The same in India, the dismemberment of the primordial victim, Purushu, by a mob offering sacrifices produces the caste system. We find similar myths in Egypt and China among their Germanic peoples everywhere. The creative power of this murder is often given concrete form in the value attributed to the fragments of the victim. Each of these is identified as producing a particular institution, a totemic clan, a territorial subdivision, or even the vegetable or animal that furnishes the community its primary food. The body of the victim is sometimes compared to a seed, which must decompose in order to germinate. This germination is the same thing as the restoration of the cultural system damaged by the preceding crisis, or the creation of an entirely new system, which appears often as the first one ever created, as a sort of invention of humanity. Unless a grain, quote, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit, end quote, from John chapter 12:24. The myths presenting the founding role of the primordial murder are so numerous that even a comparative mythologist so little given to generalizations as Mircea Eliade considered it necessary to take into account. In his Historie des Croyances et des Idées Religieuses, he speaks of a creative murder, common to many stories of origin and founding myths throughout the world. Here we have a theme whose frequently clearly surprises the comparative mythologist, a phenomenon that is trans-mythological in a way. However, in keeping with his practice of pure description, Eliade never, as far as I know, suggested the universal explanation of the theme that I think must be given. The theme of the founding murder is not only mythical, but also biblical. We find it in the book of Genesis and Cain's murder of his brother, Abel. The account of this murder is not a founding myth, it is rather the biblical interpretation of all founding myths. It recounts the bloody foundation of the beginnings of culture and the consequences of this foundation, which form the first mimetic cycle narrated in the Bible. How does Cain go about founding the first culture? The text itself does not pose this question, but it gives an answer by virtue of itself focusing on two themes. The first is the murder of Abel. The second is Cain as the founder of the first culture. This culture is clearly presented as the direct extension of the murder, and it cannot be distinguished from the ritual, non-vengeful developments stemming from this murder. Their violence inspires in these murders a salutary fear. It makes them understand the contagious character of mimetic behavior and enables them to get a glimpse of disastrous possibilities for the future. Quote, "Now that I've killed my brother," Cain says to himself, "anyone will kill me at sight." End quote. This last phrase, "anyone will kill me at sight," suggests that the human race is not limited at that time to Cain and his two parents, Adam and Eve. The name Cain designates the first community gathered around the first founding murder. This is why there are many potential murderers, and so there must be something to keep them from killing. The founding murder teaches the murderers a kind of wisdom, a form of prudence that moderates their violence. God takes advantage of the lull by promulgating the first law against murder, quote, "If anyone kills Cain, he shall be avenged sevenfold," end quote. The foundation of Canaanite culture is the first law against murder. Each time a new murder occurs, the community will emulate 7 victims in memory of the original victim, Abel. Even more than the crushing character of the retribution, it is the ritual nature of the sevenfold sacrifice that reestablishes the peace. This ritual character is rooted in the lull the original murder produced and the unanimous accord of the community in recollecting this murder. The law against murder involves nothing other than the repetition of murder. What distinguishes it from primitive vengeance is its intention rather than its intrinsic nature of the act performed. In place of a vengeful repetition that arouses new avengers, it establishes a ritualized sacrificial repetition of the unity forged in unanimity, a ceremony in which the entire community participates. This difference between ritual and repetition and vengeful repetition may appear fine and precarious, and it is, but it is nonetheless enormously important. It bears, in fact, all the cultural differences to come. The first difference is the invention of human culture. We must be careful not to read into the story of Cain a confusion between sacrifice and the death penalty, as if the two institutions pre-existed their actual invention. The law stemming from the increase in practical wisdom that the murder of Cain produces is the common matrix of all institutions. It is the fruit of the fruit of the murder of Abel. The collective murder becomes a founding murder by the way of its ritual repetitions. It is not only capital punishment, the law against murder, that we should conceive as the domestication and limitation of primitive violence by means of ritual violence. It is rather all the great human institutions. As William James observes, the sign of Cain is the sign of civilization. It is the sign of the murder protected by God. We find all other references to the founding murder in the Gospels. The idea is presupposed by two parallel passages in Matthew and Luke that mention a chain of murders similar to the Passion and going back to the foundation of the world. Matthew refers to the murder of prophets. Luke's text has the murder of all the prophets since the foundation of the world, that is, from the murder of Abel to the murder of Zechariah. The last link of this chain is the Passion, which resembles all the previous murders. It unfolds through the same structure of mimetic escalation and the single victim mechanism. Luke's reference to the murder of Abel is important for at least two reasons. The first is that it should discredit once and for all the narrow thesis that interprets the gospel comments on the murderers of the prophets as attacks against the Jewish people and so on manifestations of anti-Semitism. The Jewish people did not exist in the period of Cain and Abel is considered the first of the prophets collectively assassinated, so it is evident that the Jewish people alone could not have slain the prophets. Jesus does not wish to attack his own people. Rather, Jesus emphasizes the violence of human culture. As always, his word signifies something universally human. The second reason the reference to Abel is so important in the context of the foundation of the world is that it is a return to the theme in the story of Cain in Genesis, a deliberate adoption of the thesis that I have just set out. The first human culture has its roots in an initial collective murder, a murder similar to the crucifixion. What shows this to be is Luke's phrase, quote, since the foundation of the world, end quote. What has happened since the foundation of the world, that is, since the violent foundation of the first culture, is a series of murders like the crucifixion. There are murders founded on violent contagion, and consequently they are murders occurring because of the collective error regarding the victim, a misunderstanding caused by violent contagion. The two phrases in Luke suggest that the chain of murders is extremely long, going back to the foundation of the first culture. This type of murder, exemplified by the murder of Abel and the crucifixion, plays a founding role in all of human history. It is not by accident that the Gospels connect this murder with the katabali to kusmu, the foundation of the world. Luke in particular suggests that the murder has a founding character, that the first murder and the basis of the first culture are the same thing. The Gospel of John has a saying of Jesus that is equivalent to Luke's, and it confirms the interpretation I have just given. It is a statement found in the middle of Jesus' great speech about the devil, John chapter 8, and I have already commented it on chapter 3. It too is the definition of that which Marcia Laud calls the creative murder. Quote, he, the devil, was a murderer from the beginning, end quote. The words here translated beginning is arche in the Greek, which means origin, first appearance, or beginning. The reference cannot be to creation ex nihilo, for that is completely God's work and cannot be associated with violence. The origin or beginning must have to do with the first human culture. The word arche thus has the same sense as katable tu kosmou in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew, the foundation of the first culture. If the relation of the murder to the beginning was accidental, if it meant simply that since humans have been on earth, Satan has driven them to murder, John wouldn't mention the word origin in a connection with the first murder any more than Luke would connect the foundation of the world and the murder of Abel. These three phrases, two from Luke and one from John, signify the same thing, They indicate that between the origin and the first collective murder, there is a relation that is non-accidental. The murder and the origin are the same thing. If the devil is murderer from the origin, that means he continues to be during the rest of time. Each time the culture appears, it begins by the same type of murder. We have therefore a series of murders similar to that of passion of all founding events. If the first one is the origin of the first culture, those following must be the origin of subsequent cultures. All this agrees perfectly with what we learned before about Satan or the devil, namely that he is a kind of personification of bad contagion, just as much in its conflictive and disintegrative aspects as in its reconciling and unifying aspects. Behind all of these phases, Satan, or the devil, is the one who foments disorder, the one who sows scandals, and then at the height of the crisis that he himself provokes, Satan suddenly brings them to an end by expelling the disorder. Satan expels Satan by means of innocent victims who he succeeds in having condemned. Satan is the master of the single victim mechanism, and so he is the master of human culture, whose origin is none other than this act of murder. At the origin, not only of the Canaanite culture, but of all human cultures, is ultimately the devil, namely the bad contagion that results in violence and is expelled thanks to the unanimous misinterpretation of the following murder. How best to interpret the idea of the founding murder? How could such an idea take specific form without appearing fantastic and even absurd? We know that this murder acts as a kind of analgesic or tranquilizer for when the murderers satisfy their appetite for violence on a victim who is actually irrelevant. They are sincerely convinced that they have rid their community of someone responsible for their misfortunes. But this illusion by itself is not enough to justify belief in the founding virtue of this murder. This is a belief we have just confirmed not only to be common to all the great founding myths, but also to be spelled out in Genesis and finally in the Gospels. The temporary interruption of the crisis does not suffice to explain the universal belief of so many religions in the founding power of collective murder. Most religions believe in its power not only to found communities, but also to ensure an enduring and relatively stable organization of life. The reconciling effect of this murder, no matter how gripping it may be, cannot extend for generation upon generation. By itself, the murder cannot produce and perpetuate cultural institutions. However, there is a satisfying answer to the question I have just asked. To discover what it is, we must appeal to the first of all human institutions after the collective murder, namely the ritual repetition of the murder. Let us now quickly examine how thinkers have stated the question of the origin of cultural institutions and human societies. Since the Enlightenment, this question has been defined in terms of the most abstract rationalism has dictated. Rationalists conceive the first humans as so many little Descartes, who must have conceived in abstract fashion purely theoretically at first the institutions they wish to establish. Moving then from theory to practice, these first humans would have realized their institutional concept. Therefore, no institution could exist without an a priori idea that guides the practical elaboration. It is this idea that determines actual cultures. If things had really come about in this fashion, religion would have played no role in the origin of institutions. And indeed, in the context of the rationalism espoused by anthropological studies, religion plays no real part and so is of absolutely no use. It can only be superfluous, superficial, a secondary addition, in other words, superstition. How then should one explain the universal presence of religion, supposedly so useless, right at the heart of all human institutions? When this question is asked in a rationalist context, there is only one real logical response, that of Voltaire. Religion is defined as a parasite that attaches itself from outside to useful institutions. Deceitful and greedy priests invented it to exploit the credulity of good people for their own profit. The rationalist expulsion of religion continues to dominate contemporary anthropology, even though anthropologists and other social scientists now try to conceal somewhat the simplistic character of their views. We cannot openly repudiate the rationalist bias without transforming the universal presence of sacrificial rituals in human institutions into a formidable focal point of questioning. The modern social sciences are essentially anti-religious. If religion is not a kind of tough weed, irritating but unimportant, what can we make of it? Throughout history, religion is the constant element in diverse and changing institutions. Therefore, we cannot discount it in favor of the pseudo-solution that takes it as a mere nothing, the fifth wheel of all the coaches, without coming to grips with the opposite possibility, disagreeable as it is for modern anti-religion. The possibility is that religion is the heart of every social system, the true origin and original form of all institutions, the universal basis of human culture. The solution is all the more difficult to avoid because since the golden days of rationalism, we have learned more about ancient societies. Among many of these societies, the institutions that the Enlightenment took for indispensable to humanity didn't yet exist. In their place, there were only sacrificial rituals. Under the heading of rituals, we can roughly distinguish three types of societies. First, there's the society in which ritual now plays no role or almost no role, and that is contemporary society, our society. Next, there are or used to be societies where rituals accompanied institutions in some way and strengthened them. In this case, the ritual seems to be a supplement to institutions that do not really need it. Ancient societies and, in another sense, medieval society are of this type. It is this type that early rationalist thinkers incorrectly conceived as universal and that suggested to them the thesis of religion as parasitic. Third and finally, there are primitive or archaic societies that do not have institutions in our sense, but that have rituals instead. They have no secular institutions, only rituals. Early anthropologists used to see archaic societies as the least evolved and the closest to human origins. In spite of attempts to discredit their thesis, it is pointed in the right direction. However, we cannot adopt this thesis without highlighting and pursuing the role of sacrifice. We are led to think not only that sacrifice played an essential role in the early stages of humanity, but also that it could indeed have been the motivating force of all that appears to be specifically human in humankind. Sacrifice lies behind everything distinguishing humans from animals, behind everything enabling us to substitute properly human desire for animal instinct, namely mimetic desire. If becoming human involves, among other things, acquiring mimetic desire, it is obvious that humans could not exist in the beginning without sacrificial institutions that repress and moderate the kind of conflict that is inevitable with the working of mimetic desire. Many observers have noted that in exclusively ritual societies, the sequences of sacrificial ritual already play the role, more or less, that will become the responsibility of subsequent institutions, which we still define according to a rationalist concept of their function. To take one example, systems of education. In the archaic world, they did not exist, but rites of passage or rites of initiation played a role that prefigured them. Young people did not surreptitiously enter into their own cultures, but they were initiated through solemn procedures in which the entire community participated. These rituals of passage include ordeals, often quite painful, which inevitably evoke our own tests or ordeals involved in passing exams to get a degree, etc. Rituals of passage or initiation, like all rituals, are based on sacrifice. Accordingly, every radical change is a kind of resurrection rooted in the death that precedes it, which is the only process able to set the vital powers in motion again. In the first place, the phase of crisis, the initiates died, as it were, to their childhood. In the second phase, they rose again, capable from now on to assume their rightful place in the world of adults. In some communities, from time to time, one of the initiates did not rise again, did not come out of the ritual ordeal alive, and this was regarded as a favorable sign for all the other initiates. Everyone saw in the one death of the providential reinforcement of the sacrificial dimension of the initiation process. To say that these rituals replaced our systems of education and other institutions is to put the cart before the horse. It is the modern institutions that clearly replace the rituals after having coexisted with them for a long time. All evidence suggests that sacrificial rituals came first in all areas of life in the history of humankind. There are rites of execution, the stoning prescribed in Leviticus, for example, rites of death and birth, matrimonial rites, rites of hunting and fishing in societies that pursue these activities, agricultural rites in societies dependent on agriculture, etc. Everything we call our quote-unquote cultural institutions must stem originally from ritual acts that become so refined over the years that they lose their religious connotations and are defined in relation to the type of crises they are intended to resolve. By dint of repetition, the rituals are modified and transformed into practices that human reason alone seems to have worked out, whereas in reality, they have a religious origin. Sacrificial rituals are scheduled just at the moment needed when there is a crisis to resolve, and for good reason. They are initially nothing other than the spontaneous resolution of all crises by means of unanimous violence, crisis that occurs unexpectedly in social existence. Not solely mimetic conflicts, these crises are birth and death, changes of season, famines, disasters of all kinds, and thousands of other things besides that, right or wrong, disturb the life of primitive peoples. Human communities constantly resort to sacrifice to try to ease their distress. One such resolution of crisis is represented in a certain kind of burial mound that we found in many areas of the world. Why do certain cultures bury their victims under heaps of stones that they often shape into a pyramid form? We can explain this custom as a byproduct of ritual stonings. When a victim is stoned, the body is covered with stones. When the attackers throw a lot of stones at someone still alive, not only does the victim die, but the stones naturally take the partially conic form of a burrow or a mound. We find just this put more or less into geometrical form in the sacrificial or funerary pyramids of various peoples, beginning with the Egyptians. At first, the Egyptians formed the tomb as a truncated pyramid, only later built it with the full pyramid point. The burial tomb is invented beginning in that period when the custom of covering corpses with stones expanded in the absence of stoning victims. How do we conceive the ritual origin of political power? The origin of such power was by means of sacred monarchy, which we should also view as a modification, minute in the beginning of ritual sacrifice. The development of sacred kingship may be imagined in a scenario like the following. A victim is chosen who is intelligent and commanding. Rather than sacrificing him immediately, the community, for some reason, defers his execution, which allows him to stew in the soup of mimetic rivalries. His fate as a future sacrifice confers religious authority on him and enables him not to grasp political power, which doesn't really exist to this point, but literally to forge it. The veneration that his status as future sacrifice inspires is transformed little by little into political power. We can compare the ritual dimension of these institutions to a maternal substance, namely to an original placenta, which the rituals eliminate over time as they are transformed into de-ritualized institutions. It is like the legend about the bear cub whom his mother is formed by licking a formless little mass. The repetitions of sacrifice are like the many tongue licks needed to reach the perfect shape of a bear. The true guide of human beings is not abstract reason, but ritual. The countless repetitions shape little by little the institutions that later men and women will think they invented ex nihilo. Actually, it is religion that invented human culture. Human societies are the work of the mimetic process that has been disciplined by ritual. Human beings know very well that they cannot master mimetic rivalries on their own powers. That is why they attribute this mastery to their victims whom they take for gods. In a strictly matter-of-fact sense, they are wrong. In a deeper sense, they are right. Humanity, in my view, is the child of religion. Our institutions have to be the outcome of a slow process of secularization, which is the same thing as a sort of rationalization, and this process suggests to the functionalists that all culture should be interpreted in terms of utility and practical implementation. Modern research would have found their true origin a long time ago if it had not been handicapped by its irrational hostility to religion. We should envisage the possibility that all human institutions, and therefore humanity itself, are rooted in sacrifice. Indeed, to escape from animal instinct and arrive at mimetic desire with all its dangers of mimetic conflicts, humans have to discipline their desire, and they cannot accomplish that except by means of sacrifices. Humanity springs forth from religion, i.e. from many founding murders and the rituals that spring from them. The modern tendency to minimize religion could well be, paradoxically, the last remnant among us of a religion itself in its archaic form, which seeks to keep the sacred at a safe distance. The trivialization of religion reflects a supreme effort to conceal what is at work in all human institutions, the religious avoidance of violence between the members of the same community. The idea of a founding murder often passes for a bizarre invention, a recent aberration, a whim of a certain modern intellectuals who are strangers just as much as to common sense as to cultural realities. And yet this idea is common to the great stories of origin throughout the world, to the Bible and the Gospels. It is more likely than the various modern theories concerning the origin of societies, which all go back in one form or another to the same persistent but implausible idea of the social contract. To rehabilitate the belief of the religions that there was a founding murder, and to make it scientifically plausible, we must add to this murder the cumulative effects of rituals and to take into account the plasticity of these rituals over an extremely long period of time. Turning this murder into ritual is the first institution and the most fundamental one. It is the mother of all the others, the decisive development in the invention of human culture. The power behind the emergence of humankind is the repetition of sacrifices in a spirit of cooperation and harmony, and such cooperation and harmony are what make the sacrifices so fruitful. This thesis gives anthropology the temporal dimension missing in its approach to such social origins, and it agrees with the doctrines of the religions about themselves. From the moment when the pre-human creature, the human to be, passed over a certain threshold of mimetic contagion and the animal instinct of protection against violence collapsed, the dominance patterns, mimetic conflicts must have raged among humankind. But the raging of mimetic conflict quickly produced its own antidote by giving birth to the single victim mechanism, gods and sacrificial rituals. In spite of their own violence, the sacrificial rituals not only moderated violence but channeled it in positive humanizing directions. Because our desires are mimetic, they resemble each other and cluster together in systems of opposition that are obstinate, sterile, and contagious. This is how scandals come to be. As they become fewer and bigger, scandals plunge communities into crises that are inflamed more and more. This inflammation reaches the crucial moment when unanimous convergence of the community against the single victim results in a total scandal, the abscess of fixation that pacifies the violence and puts together again the harmony that was torn apart. The exasperation of mimetic rivalries would have prevented human societies from forming if it had not produced its own remedy at its very height. This remedy is the single victim or scapegoat mechanism, surviving in our culture in only very attenuated forms. This mechanism must have reconciled the earliest communities and given them first a ritual order and then an institutional order, which assured the community's temporal duration and relative stability. Yes, indeed, human societies must be the daughters of religion. Homo sapiens itself must be the child of the still rudimentary forms of the process I have just described. That ends Chapter 7. Chapter 8 is entitled Powers and Principalities. I have been looking forward to this one. It is actually rather short. Let's see if I can get through it right now. Yeah, let's do it. So Chapter 8 is entitled Powers and Principalities.